this for a second? I want to ask Véronique a few questions. Hello. So yeah, we listened, both of us, to a really great lecture from Emanuele last night, which was really
very informative.
Yeah, very informative. So first of all, because we haven't covered this yet, maybe you can tell a little bit about the path of his career, and then talk to us about the Italian post-war market in general, and we'll proceed from there.
Okay, I'm not very good at speaking in a microphone. I'm usually better. No, it's okay. Mr. Shitty, you ready?
Yeah, yes.
Mine is giving up.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think everybody can hear me anyway. Thank you for Sandro and for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here tonight to talk a little bit about not just the market, but more or less after hearing my colleague talk today, what I want to add is we're all asking ourselves the same question. You know, what makes an artist famous, and how is an artist going to be inscribed in the canon forever? Is it about just the sheer quality of the work? Is it a combination of factors? Is it his connection, the way he came to New York, knowing the dealers and the critics? And I have some of my former students here who have heard me many times before to talk about how, for me, the art world is really this network of dependency, and all these players need to be aligned in a certain order in order for things to happen. So it's not really solely about the quality of the work, and I think my colleagues have addressed very well why we're moved by Emblema, why Emblema is an important artist. And I want to, I guess it's a privilege of being middle-aged now, to start with a small recollection. I moved to New York to go to graduate school, moving from Paris in the early 80s, and the exhibition to this day, I still remember walking around, and I hold the catalog so dearly I probably will go bankrupt before I have to sell it, is this wonderful exhibition that was organized at PS1 in 1985 called The Knot, which was really, I think, for a lot of people, a lot of New Yorkers at that time, the first time they really understood what arte povera was, and the first time they actually could see the work. I remember Pistoleto's Venus downstairs in the boiler. I mean, I was coming from France, I was already a graduate student, I was already interested in modern art. For me, arte povera was as important as the Nouveau Realiste, as important as abstract expressionism, certainly as important as American minimalism. Not growing up in the US, we had that chance of having a little bit of distance from that hegemony, and I would say nearly sometimes imperialism that led these American artists to take over, basically. And I was amazed that actually the show was at PS1 and not at MoMA. Because according to my standard as a European, this is where the show should have been. I mean, PS1 at that point was certainly not associated with MoMA yet. It was an alternative space that had wonderful residency for students and artists, but that stuck with me forever. And that, as I grew and developed my career and my expertise in the history of the art market, I realized that something really interesting had happened in the 50s and the 60s in this town. In New York, in the 60s and the 50s, as my colleague described, there was a lot of back and forth between Italy and the Americans. Italian artists were doing well, they were shown, and the same thing happened for the French. Soulage was doing extremely well. He had retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art even before some of the American, their market, their collecting base was really, really strong. And suddenly, and it's interesting because you've all kind of corroborated this, late 60s, early 70s, the European disappeared. And it was not because the relationship died, it was just a very, very interesting thing. And I think at that point, it was the power of the triumph of the power of the American art scene and the New York art scene that totally dwarfed the rest of the relationship, and these relationships were never the same. I think for us, and this is why I think it's an exciting moment for Emblema, if we want to maybe go closer to our time, we want to think that the resurgence of this interest in Italian art obviously has happened through the galleries, and we always have to praise the galleries. They're the gatekeeper, they're the visionary, they're the people that put their life, their capital, their livelihood on the line in order to get us, the public, to connect with artists at that point. So I think, Alma, you said it very well, the role of the private gallery were essential. But it's true that, I would say, for the last decade, starting in the 2000s, the market and the auction house allowed us to think about these Italian artists in a different way. And this was obviously because, you know, the big auction house, Christie's and Sotheby's, started Italian sale in London. It happened in October once a while, and I just did a little bit of research and numbers, which is not my forte, but you have to realize, so since 99 and then 2000, Christie's and Sotheby's have had Italian sale in London, post-war Italian sale in London. And these sales grew from 5 million to now 28 million, which is the last of dollars. And what is really fascinating for me is that in the last sale, 2013, talking to my colleagues in London, they could confirm to me that 60% of the buyers were international. So what does it tell us? It could tell us two things. And they know, sometimes a little cynical. So the cynical part of it would be, well, and I think it's happening with the French Nouveau Realists too, the market for the big top guys in the States, the big abstract expressionists, the big minimalists, is so high and so tough and so hard that now interesting collectors that are interested and wanting but not being able to play in that game are able to then look at other things. And I think that's where the post-war Italian artists are coming. That's where the resurgence of interest in the French Nouveau Realist, I think. So in a certain way, by default, the Italian artists, the post-war Italian artists are finally gaining not just the critical reception and the critical acceptance, historical acceptance that they've had, and they had in Europe for quite a while, but now that market validation, which seems to be so important to the new generation of collectors. And unfortunately, these new collectors are here to go. They're not going anywhere. They're here to stay, and us as our professionals, we have to learn how to not just educate them, but also, you know, cater and try to kind of help them grow. So I think that's one thing that I think is really important. Emblema's market, and I think Emblema in general, is just, I think, at the cusp. Obviously, the artists we've talked a lot about, the Boetti, the Burri, the Fontana, the Manzoni, the Pistoletto even, not yet Marceau Merz, are really there in the multi-million-dollar price range. And obviously there's a big gap between the primary and the secondary market for Emblema compared to these artists. But I think, I don't want to say, well, this is due, and most of you probably know about this idea of the telemarketing and stuff, and I actually don't think this is the only cause of this. I think a lot of the things you both discussed in terms of him being solitary, in terms of him maybe not being as kind of maybe involved with the rest of the people, that has also affected it. I think more probably than that telemarketing, I think. I think it's an exciting moment because we're discovering him, we're able to kind of open up a little bit the way we can talk about him and we can see him. I think also one thing that makes it really exciting for us and for the future collector is the work on the catalogue raisonné, which I think that will change forever the course of that history. It will flip it over on its head, and with the catalogue raisonné, I think
shortly that the catalogue raisonné has been written by Luciano Coronel, who has written books of artists such as Lucio Fontana and Pino Pascali, among others, and it will be published soon. So
it's published, coming up soon. And I think this is really, you know, in the industry, a catalogue raisonné is kind of your Bible. It allows people to, first of all, understand what the work is and the gambit of it. I think one of the things also that's very important for Emblema is to realize how prolific it was and how he's continued working through decades. And I think that's also a challenge for artists to sustain a career for so long And we know that, you know, we have a tendency to say, well, you know, this is the iconic moment. Like people talk about Basquiat in 1982, and then, well, the 1985 is not as good as stuff. So I think that's a challenge for Emblema, is these long decades of really prolific production, which the catalogue raisonné can help us master and can help us understand. I think that will be, the catalogue raisonné will really change that. And I also think that what we need is that final recognition of the market for the puzzle to be totally complete. So it's not so much the critical reception that we have already, the historical significance that we have already, the connection with the groups and the others and the international collection, but it's that little piece that's missing.
I just want to say, because we haven't addressed this directly, that Emblema was in very well known galleries, right, in his early career, and at some point, and he was involved with Argan, as you noted, and at some point his gallery, his main gallery, got into some kind of trouble, and he was secluded. So that was the moment that he had to make his own choices and be his own like entrepreneur. So that's very important because the choices he made later were very effective of his process and his career, and this is why we're actually sitting here today, I guess, in a sense.
And if I could add also, I think something that is really, I think, interesting is, as I said, you know, if you describe the art world as this kind of organism where various people juggle for position and their power shift according to decades, I think what's also was an issue for Emblema was that he had a real strong collecting base. I mean, when you think that the Agnelli family was collecting his work in depth, so he was really well integrated in these top collecting families. He was working for Agnelli in his house, doing work in situ. You know, he was working, you know, with a couple of really old prominent family, decorating their villas and their houses. And then even furniture, yeah, Emmanuel was talking about this. I'm like dying to see these furniture pieces. But that kind of created a sense of legitimacy for him. I mean, he was well collected. And then that transition into the telemarketing was complicated because it could have been seen as a democratization of art and the capacity for people to actually buy art. So at that point, I don't know if all of you know about what's going on.
Let's explain a little bit what
a really fascinating Italian businessman, Corbelli, created that idea of selling art on television, kind of like whatever it's called now. And it was very innovative, and you could put you could pay in installments. So in a certain way, it was a great way to reach out to a bigger audience. And we were talking with Emmanuel yesterday. He was saying that's great. You know, you could be a school teacher and buy and spend, you know, give a few $100s here and then eventually you'll have the work of art. So that was something really, really interesting. But I think it upset and turned and was kind of seen as it put off the connection with the older collectors. So there became this disconnect between the traditional collecting group of people and that new people. But I was amazed. Emmanuel was telling us yesterday that sometimes that telemarketing, they used to sell 3 or 4 or sometimes even 5 paintings a day. So obviously, in terms of an outcome, you didn't have the control that you could have in a gallery, because the gallery is there with a curator, who's somebody who writes a catalogue, who kind of mediated between us and the public and the work. But it was business-wise successful.
I mean, it's really interesting to see his whole process, because he started really from a small town, you know, in Italy, and moved, you know, tried to find his way in the Italian art world, and he was a simple man. He was a farmer, or from a farmer's family. Is that correct? Yes. And so he really tried to understand by himself art, and he was exposed, as you said, to New York, and telemarketing was a way for him to reach for the people, you know, from where he came from. And later on, actually, the Museum Emblema was established, and it's mostly dedicated to education, working with the community. So I think that's a very interesting path in terms of just his choices were very interesting, and I think led us. So just a question. So how? Okay, I guess we talked about what's happening here. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, no.
Anyway,
But I have to say, I think one last thing that I think is interesting, and I think it came through both of your presentation a little bit, is that there was indeed in Italy some forces that made it very difficult.
yeah.
And these institutional forces,
Yes.
especially the predominance of certain critics, I think we have the same problem in France with the monopolization of Restani, that kind of stuff. That also made it difficult. I think the lack of museum, obviously, of contemporary art museum, is one big piece that misses usually in the puzzle. I think that also was another challenge for him.
And actually, so we had a solo show called Transparency in LA. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, this exhibition was organized by Emanuele with a curator from Los Angeles, Peter Frank, one respected curator there. It was at the Italian Cultural Institute, and a few of the paintings that are here were there. And I think that the family is now doing something very smart, and in trying to bring Emblema's work, to the world, to a larger audience. They're trying to connect in different ways, and by showing the work in the U.S., but also by showing the work in Italy, because there's a lot of people in Italy who don't really know it. So the show in Los Angeles and the exhibition here in New York and future exhibitions that are going to happen in Italy are all part of a strategic plan in a way, but something really well put out of sharing Emblema's work with as many people as possible, and also bringing the Emblema work to the knowledge of a wider community of artists, curators, critics, etc., which I think is really important, for the artist. The show was quite successful. It was really beautiful, and I think that actually someone fell in love with the work and loved it and bought a painting. And this person had never heard of Emblema, but it shows that when you really have a passion for art and you really like something, it's not about the name, which we know that nowadays is extremely important, but there's still some collectors who will buy what they like, whether the artist is known or unknown to them, they will, and this person must be really happy having an Emblema in her home now, and I understand that the exhibition has been successful here as well. Yeah.
I think we covered, this is a man who lived for many years, Emanuele. How old was he when he passed away? When he died?
2006.
How old was he?
77, I think.
He was 77, so this is like, we covered, I think,
Yeah.
almost his
Yeah.
whole life, so in a little bit less than an hour. So thank you guys, and I want to see if anyone has any particular questions. I know we didn't talk so much about the specific, soil, and yeah, you can ask.
Yeah, I had a question. I didn't quite understand his connection to this telemarketing that you were talking about.
So when Emblema, when he stopped having a gallery, the man Corbelli, who organized this, took him, but there's a lot of other artists. It's not just selling his work. Actually, Boeri was selling also his maps through telemarketing. So that became the primary mode for him to distribute the works because he didn't have gallery representation during that.
The maps that are sold for over $1 million today were sold in television auction. Telemarket, allow me, was a sort of an auction on TV. So people are just sitting on their couch, and this man just started a TV program, and you're like the Antique Roadshow. In the Antique Roadshow, they're just explaining the piece and giving them a value. The difference in the telemarket in Italy was that the show was starting, there was an easel, the work was on the easel, and the guy would go, well, this is the fantastic piece by Salvatore Emblema, we're starting at 2000, and they would receive phone calls, live, which were actually, they were putting like some sort of reservation to the work, because they were reserving viewing at home. So they would bring the work, and then obviously the auction house would go not to just that piece, they would bring several other pieces that were similar in order to...
In case it didn't...
In case that, exactly, for some reason,
couch.
as you understand. So this was the telemarketing, and this was an invention by this Mr. Corbelli in Italy, who just started a program that was once a week, and then it became twice a week, it became 3 times a week. And then all of a sudden...
It didn't go very well.
It went ahead for several years, actually. Several years.
Overdone.
Yeah.
Probably overdone.
And they went over the fact that then some artists like Boetti, you could buy a map by Boetti, that nowadays if you go to Mrs. Gladstone to buy a map, you would need a pocket that's beyond $1 million. You could buy it for the equivalent of $20,000 today, $15,000. That's it.
Even at the beginning of the 2000s, when MOCA was able to acquire a Boetti ID, the first ID that he made, the price, I think it was something like 120,000. That's what we paid for the work.
And now...
No, now you still have to get close to the $1 million, otherwise you would never be able to. But this is the process.
We were able to acquire either by gift or purchase.
Just to give you an idea what the telemarketing, it wasn't a telemarketing, it was called the name.
And he also did this only for about 3 years.
Yeah.
He did it
About 3 years.
From 2003 till a little bit before he passed away, which was in 2006. So
But
it was a long period of
that's
time.
a long
It was a very
time.
intense
Yeah.
period of time.
I think also the moral of the story, which is really interesting, because we're not talking about a remote time. It's not like television in the 60s. It's the 90s. It's that now, most of, we have internet platform like Panelists, Arts, who do only online, and none of us are thinking it's really terrible. I'm not even talking about eBay or Amazon, but if you follow a little bit what's happening in the auction house, both Christie's and Sotheby's now, you can bid online. I mean, I guess the senior management is always concerned about how people are going to be willing to do it for more than a few million, and now one of the $10 million for the Hooper last year. So it's obviously it was kind of a visionary moment.
In a way, yes.
People were kind of not quite associating really television with a kind of a lowbrow thing, but now none of us would think differently, I think.
But nowadays, when you buy through the internet, you don't know who the buyer is, so it's the same thing. Galleries can control where the work goes because they will be selective about who gets the work in the end, which may upset some collectors who really want to buy the work, but not having a relationship with the gallery advantage because they'll be the last, in the line. Exactly, so they have to go to the auction houses in order to buy, or to Panelists, or to smaller auctions, but it's out there, it's more democratic in a way, so exactly the same thing, it just happened.
It was early for his time in a way.
He was probably too early for his time, yeah.
There's a question.
I would like to ask about the museum. I understand there is an Emblema museum, and whether educationally it does something special for younger artists and unknown artists, and sort of paying back for what he suffered getting there.
Oh, well, I think I have to to answer the question. Please, Vittorio, can you translate for me?
Okay. Go ahead.
Bene, l'atteggiamento che come eredi di Emblema e come museo abbiamo deciso di avere è di operare in maniera indiretta.
So the behavior that the museum has decided to have is to operate in an indirect way. Not directly, but in an indirect way, which is...
Noi promuoviamo Emblema invogliando le nuove generazioni a capire cos'è l'arte contemporanea.
So we promote Emblema by stimulating new generations of artists to understand better what contemporary art is.
Noi al Museo Emblema parliamo pochissimo di Emblema.
In the Museum Emblema, as a matter of fact, there's little talk about Emblema himself.
Ma parliamo dei meccanismi fondamentali dell'arte.
So instead, we talk about the fundamental mechanisms of art.
Se alla fine del nostro discorso siamo in grado di portare un esempio su Emblema, allora abbiamo reso un buon servizio alla cultura e ad Emblema allo stesso
So if at the end of our workshops and talks and explanations, we're able to also, in this discourse, show an example with Emblema, then we will have succeeded in talking about contemporary art and in the specific case of Emblema, so in creating the power. So Museum Emblema is not promoting Emblema directly just by PR marketing Emblema on with advertisements and things, actually the other way around. Museum Emblema decided to talk about art in general and contemporary art specifically in order to create a platform to show where actual Emblema would fit in this platform in terms of contemporary art. This is what the Emblema Museum is doing. And as far as I can add, I know what they're doing. They have workshops with families, students, young children, and the way, if I may, you just stop me if I say something that's not correct. It's just by teaching art, or no, leading people through a walk that speaks about art. Inspiring
the young generation.
Looking at different angles, or from different angles, the contemporary art.
Was it a mission that Emblema himself wanted, or something that you decided?
Emblema himself wanted this mission. Emblema used to say, the art is a fact of life. It's a fact of daily life. If the children are able to feel feeling like anger, like love, he can understand, he must understand the principles of contemporary art. What I want to do is to link these daily principles to the principles of aesthetic. And we try to go along this way. At of course, we have also another aim, also because we have maybe one of the first archive that completely shared from the estate to the collectors. We try to do something that can resemble a sort of enlarged family. Because we have painting in the same way that collectors have painting. So we have maybe the same interest. And we have to work together. We work to the collector in exactly the same way the collector works for us. And in this way, we try to follow the democracy, an idea of democracy in contemporary art. And I think it could be a very good challenge for a new generation of collectors, because maybe the time of the elitism, the time of the prince that show his power to the people, maybe is gone. Now we have to looking for a new way to be great collector, and now we need to find a new way to be a new estate. So the times are changing. We are trying with Museum Emblema to follow this changing, defending it in the same way the historic value of the art. So that's our aim, more or less. And sorry for my English.